Welcome to episode number 6 of the Church Leadership Podcast here on YouTube. And in this episode, Annie and I sit down with our great friend Robert Mullins, and we talk about things like disciple making, and I know you'll enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Church Leadership Podcast, your weekly source for encouraging and equipping local church leaders, with your hosts, Mark Gainey and Andy Frazier. In each episode, Andy and Mark sit down with church leaders that you should know. We believe these honest conversations will be helpful and encouraging to you as you lead the local church. Here is this week's episode.
Welcome to episode number 6. This episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Insight Ministries. Insight Ministries is a coaching, consulting, and web development company that helps churches reignite the flame of revitalization. You can find out more information about Insight at their website at insightministries.org. That's Insight, I-N-C-I-T-E, insightministries.org. Now for our episode.
We're glad you've joined us today on the podcast. Today we have with us Dr. Robert Mullins from Crossroads Community Church in Elmore, Alabama. Robert serves as the lead pastor there at Crossroads. He also is the executive director of Passion Tree, passiontree.org. It is a network of disciple-making pastors. Robert, we're so glad you've joined us today.
It's great to be here. I'm excited. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to talk with you. So, Robert, tell us a little bit. We know you really well, and we want the folks listening to know you well also. And so you serve as lead pastor there at Crossroads. Tell us a little bit about you, your family, because we know family is really important to you.
Sure.
And tell us a little bit about what God's doing right there at Crossroads.
Yeah, well, I've been married to Pam for almost 25 years, and we have 2 sons, Hudson, who's a junior at the University of Southern Mississippi, and my youngest son, Nick, is a freshman at the University of North Georgia, and they are doing some great stuff in their lives, pursuing God, making disciples, all that stuff. And we are in the middle of them in North Montgomery in Elmore County, and we get to just try to pour into people's lives and do life together with a great group of folks at Crossroads, formerly Mount Hebron. It was Mount Hebron Baptist Church West for 175 years. And this year God changed the name of the church, and we're Crossroads Community Church, and we're hoping that will be a tool that will let us get into the community, the neighborhood, and even other communities where our folks live. We're kind of a regional church, and so it makes it a lot of fun. I'm a creative guy by nature, and so an artist. I love to paint. I love to create. I love to do these things, with arts, crafts, and those sorts of stuff. And so, by nature, maybe an entrepreneur. And so that's where Passion Tree came from, is leading opportunities for pastors to network together, but also to retreat and to maybe have a few meetings, round tables, that sort of stuff, to come stronger together, to have a network and friendship base, to do life together, but also to learn how to do ministry together and make disciples that make disciples as they become disciple makers themselves. So that's what we've been about. And it's been a process. It's been a slow growth, which is healthy. And we've been doing this for about 5 years at Passion Tree and 6 years at Crossroads. So God is just doing some great stuff in our life. We're thankful to be a part of it.
Awesome. Well, when we talk about disciple making, discipleship, we say those words and we mean one thing, but some people listening may hear something very different. So
Sure.
I think that may be a challenge that you had to face at Crossroads. And so talk to us a little bit about what does disciple making mean? And,
Right.
and in a local church context, what does that look like? Because we know that it doesn't look like 5 p.m. on a Sunday evening, right?
Right,
So
right.
What is that?
Well, you're really talking about definitions and mindsets. You're talking about what things mean in a culture. You're basically talking about what culture are you existing in. So if you're a culture of programs, then discipleship is going to be at 5 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon or a 6:30 on a Wednesday night or whatever it is. But the reality, what Jesus told us, was that we're supposed to love God, love people. That's the great commandment. The great commission would be to go and make disciples. And so what we have to do is realize that if we love God and we love people, then we're going to naturally make disciples. It's going to be an outpouring of who we are and our relationship with Him. The way that plays out is we have to, as church leaders and as people in the church, we have to maybe take a step back and evaluate where we are, where we've been, and then maybe even take the guts to redefine some things that may be cultural norms. So that means we're going to actually begin to try to change the culture.
And that's a quick and easy process, right?
Yeah, quick fix like a microwave. No, I'm kidding. Absolutely not. It's a slow process, and it's one that you want to invest intentionally in a few people, not everybody in the church. And I can remember early on in our church when we began to try to change the culture and become a disciple making culture, I was disappointed with the number of people that stayed for a potluck to become. If you want to be a disciple maker, then come to the potluck and stay. And we had about 30 or 40 people stay and sign up, and I wanted 200 people. But the reality was that when we got back and we looked at what we were doing, if we'd had 200 people show up, we wouldn't have known what to do with them.
Right.
We wouldn't have had a place to put people. We wouldn't have groups or huddles to put people in, D groups. And looking at it, it was absolutely God's timing to go methodical and slow, and then all of a sudden you have a tipping point that you go, 5, 6, 7 years down the road, you're in the middle of revitalizing a church, and what you attempted to do was to just be obedient to Christ. Because what has happened is over the years we have become a program-driven church culture, and the more we can get away, not necessarily get away from some of those things, they're okay, but just make sure that we're being honest to do what He's called us to do, and stay focused on that.
Well, it sounds like that's your passion, no pun intended there.
Yeah.
Well, we're glad that that's your passion, and we're glad that we get to do some of those things with you and be involved in some of the things that not just Crossroads, but Passion Tree's involved in.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about Passion Tree. Where'd that come about?
Sure.
And tell us a little bit about what God's doing there.
Right. Well, it's really exciting. Back up a little bit. My ministry background is 22 years as a full-time youth pastor, and I was a youth pastor coming out of seminary, and I worked all over the South, and just had a great ministry, and just wonderful to see how I've been able to do that. But the key was we always did it by disciple making. We didn't call it that. We just had kids over to the house all the time.
Right.
And we were just teaching them and training them and equipping them and loving on them and doing life. And we'd usually have kids get there early, and we'd have to kick them out, because they were staying over the official time and everything. But what we were doing was building a relationship, and we were making disciples, just being obedient to what He called us to do. So with that background, and then God called me to be a lead pastor, there were some things in youth ministry that I wasn't able to do. And I can remember thinking, gosh, I'm not working as hard as a lead pastor as I did in youth ministry. And God just there was a moment where I said there were some things missing, and it was those intentional relationships that I had with students that I felt like I wasn't able to do with the church as a whole. They call it, playing favorites, right? And so I didn't want to be guilty of that, so we didn't do any of that. Well, the Lord began to put this thing on my heart to actually begin working and discipling pastors and networking with pastors. And so those things that I was missing, like camps and retreats, God said, why don't you do a retreat for pastors? Mm-hmm. And so back in 2014, we took 7 pastors, and we went to Black Mountain, North Carolina, and we were in a cabin for about a week. And God really began to form a brotherhood, but also a synergy of this is something that a lot of people need. Mm-hmm. And the more that we walked through this, a few years later, as it grew, every year it's grown incrementally, and we've moved from not just a retreat base, but to roundtables and some meetings and even some training meetings of how to disciple people and those sorts of things, to even huddles where we meet and disciple pastors for about an hour and 15 during the week, and sit there on a video huddle, Google Hangout or whatever, Zoom or something, and just intensely walk with pastors for a year, or even second chair leaders in the church. And then the challenge would be for them to multiply at the end of that time. And so it's grown. So Passion Tree has become something bigger way than I thought it would at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. But now we're very excited about where God has it, and we're going to be multiplying even some great events that will come out in this next year in 2019. So it's pretty cool.
Well, I was in that room when Passion Tree had already started, but I was in the room when this idea of these pastors' huddles kind of, God birthed that probably in your mind, or it cemented it in your mind at least. So talk to us a little bit about that. Tell us the story of how that came about.
Yeah, well, we had a roundtable at our church, and we had 15 pastors show up. God gave me this brainstorm for, let's do steak dinner. Let's have a great time of testimony and let them see what they're missing, and then they'll want to become disciple-making pastors. Well, sure enough, it worked. It worked better than we thought. And what happened was one of the pastors there raised his hand and said, Glenn Sandifer from Gordo raised his hand, and he wouldn't mind me telling you because he's told a lot of people, I've never been discipled. He said, I've been a pastor for 30 years, but I've never been discipled. I've never had somebody intentionally pour into me the irreducible minimums of what Jesus taught us. And so, and then he looked back at me and he said, and what are you going to do about it? And overnight, we were meeting again the next day, and overnight, God just really convicted me and saying, hey, I actually want you to do something with this, not just have a great event. And that day, I said, if you want to sign up to be in a huddle, you can. And that was really the tipping point of it. We hadn't looked back, and it's multiplied. I think we've got easy somewhere between 80 and 90 pastors in Alabama being discipled right now.
That is awesome.
Yeah, that's 3 years. That's what it is. I mean, that's the whole movement. I mean, if you don't realize, when Jesus told his disciples, go and make disciples, he's talking to a few men, and he poured his life into them, and then he multiplied that group. If those guys hadn't have been obedient, and you look back at, by the way, the original 12, you have one that left, we know that, but then all the rest of them died this crazy death except one, and his whole life was torture anyway. So you got these guys that go out and passionately serve, and what they're doing the whole time is make disciples. My favorite is Thomas. He gets such a bad rap. Doubting Thomas, he doubted all this stuff. You and I would do the same thing. Let's be honest. I want to see the holes too, okay? I want to see his side. Doubting Thomas, this big doubter, he ended up his life literally all the way around the world. He was stoned to death on top of a mountain in India. And, the Thomasinians are still a group of Christians in Asia. And, I mean, you talking about going somewhere. This guy, he might as well have gone around the world twice because we have all this great transportation, all this stuff. He didn't. He had his feet, and probably a boat here and there and camel here and there. But he moved all the way from the Middle East all the way to India. And it's pretty an awesome thing when you realize the passion that these men made disciples with. The truth of the matter is, if they had not done it, if they had acted like the American church today, we would simply not be here. Mm-hmm. And that's the kicker for this. We've got to go back. A friend of mine, Ken Adams, and you guys probably said this on the podcast before, but pastor in Atlanta, Noonan, Georgia, he said, Jesus started the church the way he intended it. Now he intends the church the way he started it. And we have to be on mission with that. We have to love God, love people, and make disciples. And really, that's all.
Well, we know you're passionate about making disciples. We know you're passionate about equipping and encouraging pastors like we want to do, and we're thankful for what God is doing in your life and in your family and at Crossroads there. It's crazy to see a church that's not your stereotypical church in a huge city, metro area, or suburb of that metro area. You guys are a little different when it comes to that typical norm, but God's blessing you guys, and that's all attributed to the fact that you guys are doing what you said you're doing. You've started small, you've built it strong, and God's blessing and doing some great things, and there's a ripple effect going on just because of your obedience to the Lord in our state and even beyond. We're seeing some great things. What is one thing that maybe you've learned, or maybe God's even speaking to you right now, that you feel like you might could share with somebody who's listening today that might be something they need to hear, something encouraging? Maybe somebody's wondering, do I need to get in on this disciple-making stuff? Is it too hard? Is it worth it? Or I'm in the middle of it and I'm not seeing what I thought was going to happen. It's not successful like I thought it was going to be. Or maybe a pastor out there that maybe he's feeling isolated or lonely and needs some brothers to come along beside him. Is there something you can say that might be encouraging to them?
Sure. I would say really, to me, disciple-making, to me, what is happening with Passion Tree, I don't know, for some reason it boils back to John 15. And Jesus said, I'm the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you'll bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. It goes down to verse 8 and it says, by this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. there's a kicker in there, and it says, if you remain in me. It says, if you abide in me. There's this rest moment that we as pastors, that we as staff, that we as church leaders, that we as the lay people in a church, we're just, doing life. We do not abide in Christ. We're so busy. We just go, 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 go. And the reality is, every single day, Christ is waiting on us with a cup of coffee. He is waiting on us with a conversation. He is waiting on us with an arm to hug us, to hold us, to encourage us, to love us. And man, it's great to have that from brothers and sisters, and we obviously want to be about that, man. Ephesians, Paul's all over that. But if we're not first getting that relationship with Christ, Andy, to answer your question, I think for me it's kind of twofold, and I've shared this with you before. But if we can be the kind of people that answer the question, what did you have in your quiet time? What did you have in your time with the Lord today? And who are you discipling? Then we're going to be living out the intimacy and the challenge that Christ wants us to do in our everyday life, and it will enrich us. It will fulfill us. We'll be living out Galatians 2:20 because we'll have that identity of Christ in us and through us, and other people will see it.
That is powerful.
Yeah,
and that's what it's about. Absolutely.
Yeah. And we read over that so much, and we just kind of just hit it and run. We say, well, if you do this, but the reality is, slow down. Breathe a minute. If you have to figure that out with work, if you have to figure that out with, your family, figure out how to do it and get folks on the same page and make that happen. So it's good.
Okay, so we mentioned a few resources already. PassionTree.org. That's going to be in the show notes. So you can link directly to that. But if there's a pastor or a church leader listening to this episode right now, and they're struggling, and so when you talked about rest, they may have said, I'm not getting it. They're strung out. They've never been discipled. Maybe they want to be a part of this, but they don't know how. What would your advice be to them?
Well, the advice would probably be easier than the reality. The advice would be find a disciple-making pastor, get in a relationship with them, be discipled by them, be that. But that may not be an easy thing to do. Obviously, you can contact us. We'll try to connect you somewhere in your area, especially if you're in Alabama. We've got a great movement. But, the Lord is really doing some things outside of Alabama right now as well with the organization, with men that have been to some of our retreats and things like that are doing it in other places. But I think that I would tell someone, it's first of all, it's not about a curriculum. As a matter of fact, if you want a curriculum, let's get your Bible, let's go through John, then let's go through Acts, and let's see how God started the church. And also, something huge with me that I think is therapeutic, but it's also biblical, extremely biblical, and we don't talk enough about it, is journaling. Journaling is something that God told us to do in Scripture, and people are like, oh, you're making that up. No, I'm not. In Habakkuk chapter 2, 1 through 3, it clearly talks about a plan to stand on your guard, hear from the Lord, write these things on tablets. Okay, so back in the day, tablets are not you etching something in a rock. It's actual paper. It's actually a journal. So write these things on tablets, and then watch this. After you stand guard, after you hear from the Lord, you write it down, and then it says this, and He will surely not delay. Like, you will watch Him answer prayers when you journal stuff. So if you hear from God, if you think you have this relationship, you think you're, whatever, you're trying to get on that path, if you don't write it down, then you don't have anything to go back to. You don't have proof record. You don't have that guy with you when you hit a hole in one. You don't have that stuff, right? Because you don't get to go back and say, look at what God did and circle it. And I love my journal because I get to go back and I get to date, timestamp stuff that God answered a prayer. That I prayed 3 months before. That sort of stuff. So anyway, that's what I'd say.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for joining us here today. We've enjoyed thoroughly hearing about your heart, about what God's doing in your life as a pastor, as a leader, as a disciple maker. We're excited to hear what God's doing there at your church and how He has brought about a huge change in well, really old. If you're 175 years old, that's old church. Old.
Sure. Yeah.
But an older, established, traditional church, and how He has man, he has brought you guys through some interesting things, and how he's continued to do that, and how God is bringing about this renewed passion among pastors in our state for making disciples. Right. I think it's so old, it's new again, kind of thing. Yeah. But I'm thankful for it. Yeah. I'm thankful to see that guys are having a renewed desire to see what is this whole Great Commission about. And you got one more thing I think you wanted to share before we go.
You guys might not like this, but I just want to tell you guys thank you for what you're doing. You're doing some stuff that, I'm old school, man. I'm you guys, you're hitting some great things with this media and technology and the podcast thing that are able to get it out there and get the message out there. So I just want to say thank y'all. Wow. Keep up the good work. And personally, I know you're disciple makers and you're excited to be on that same path as well. But I'll tell you this, and this is what, I'd say this can not only change the life of a church, the culture of a church. It can change a person, and it can give them a new joy too and a new life. That you're not just going through those motions of being a good church member or a good pastor or a good whatever. You're actually living out John, where it says that I've come to give you life and life to the full, and that's what it's about.
That is awesome. Thank you, man. We love you, and we appreciate you being on here. And those listening, we hope you have been encouraged and equipped to better lead your local church, and we can't wait to see you guys next time. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Make sure to subscribe and review, and we hope you'll join us again next week.